Let us discuss about TS of ovary. Already we know ovaries are female gonads and pair of ovaries are there. And this is a TS, transverse section of ovary. In this ovary we can see all the stages which we will come across during oogenesis. During oogenesis. I have drawn all the stages here. Already we have studied about a process of oogenesis so that it becomes easy to understand all these stages. And we know that in the ovary of embryonic state of a female, where oogonia are present. They are diploid in the ovary of embryonic state of female, oogonium. It's a egg mother cell or ova mother cell is present. In the first step, by mitosis, these oogonial cells increase and they become a couple of millions of oogonial cells. That is by mitosis. These are also oogonial cells only, or oogonia. Oogonial cells. Their number is increased, and the number is increased only during embryonic state. And when a birth of that female child takes place, in the ovary of that female child, there are around couple of oogonial cells. In all of them, meiosis first starts and arrested, stops at the prophase first. Then such oogonial cells are named as primary oocytes. I have drawn here primary oocyte, and here these are also diploid. Primary oocyte is also diploid. No doubt meiosis started but stops at prophase first. This is primary oocyte. And now from birth to puberty of that female, some follicles will develop. Around the primary oocyte, a single layered membrana granulosa is formed. Now, this becomes primary follicle. Primary follicle. In this primary follicle, this is primary follicle. In this primary follicle, primary oocyte is present. Primary oocyte is there in primary follicle because around the primary oocyte, a layer of membrana granulosa is formed. Now, the primary follicle is formed. Here also, that is diploid in nature. And gradually, layer of membrana granulosa are increased and theca is also formed. Theca is also formed. Once many layers of membrana granulosa and theca are formed around primary oocyte, then it is said to be secondary follicle. Secondary follicle. Whether it is primary follicle or secondary follicle, there is a primary oocyte is diploid. And now what happens is a cavity is appeared at the center, and theca is distinguished into external, outer theca externa and inner theca interna. Theca will be two-layered, theca interna and theca externa, and a cavity is appeared. Once the cavity is appeared, now this is tertiary follicle. This is tertiary follicle. Once the tertiary follicle is formed, that the primary oocyte present in tertiary follicle, meiosis first gets completed. As meiosis first gets completed, two cells are formed. One is larger secondary oocyte, that is there here. Secondary oocyte. As meiosis first is completed, this secondary oocyte is haploid. In addition to that, another smaller cell is formed, that is first polar body, that is also haploid. Remember, during meiosis first, when two cells are formed, karyokinesis, division of nucleus, no change in it. So that the first polar body and the secondary oocyte are haploid. But the difference is unequal cytokinesis. Unequal cytokinesis. That leads to the formation of larger secondary oocyte and a smaller first polar body. In this tertiary follicle, there is a secondary oocyte is there. Remember, they may ask neat question. Which of the following is there in primary follicle? Primary oocyte, secondary oocyte, like this they would give. In the primary follicle, primary oocyte is there. Another question. Which of the following is present in secondary follicle? Primary oocyte, secondary oocyte, tertiary oocyte, like this. Even in secondary follicle, primary oocyte is there. Remember this point, where they would give another answer, secondary oocyte also. We may get confused. In secondary follicle, secondary oocyte, wrong. In a secondary follicle, there is a primary oocyte. Third neat question may be asked. In the tertiary follicle, which of the following is there? Secondary oocyte. There also they would give primary oocyte, secondary oocyte, even a tertiary oocyte. The answer is secondary oocyte. In a tertiary follicle, secondary oocyte. In a primary follicle and a secondary follicle, there is a primary oocyte. Primary oocyte. And the difference between a secondary follicle and a tertiary follicle, membrana granules are no difference, but the theca, there is a difference. Inner theca interna and outer theca externa. And one more very important difference is, in a secondary follicle, primary oocyte is there. In tertiary follicle, secondary oocyte is there. That is formed after the completion of meiosis first. And now, this tertiary follicle gets matured and it becomes Graphene follicle. Graphene follicle. It becomes Graphene follicle. Secondary oocyte becomes Graphene follicle. This Graphene follicle is a matured ovarian follicle. Usually, when that female reaches puberty age, the first Graphene follicle will form. It is a matured ovarian follicle in which there is a ovum or egg or secondary oocyte is developed. That is Graphene follicle. And it is having the cavity named antrum. It is having the cavity inside named antrum, and that cavity is filled with liquor folliculi. That is filled with liquor folliculi. And this membrana granulosa is many layered. At one side, that secondary oocyte is placed, and this secondary oocyte is having 3 additional membranes in addition to plasma membrane. There are 3 additional membranes in addition to plasma membrane. Those 3 additional membranes are vitelline membrane, zona pellucida, and corona radiata. Vitelline membrane, zona pellucida, and corona radiata. And then this membrana granulosa is covered by theca, but the theca is distinguished into inner theca interna and outer theca externa. And inner theca interna is cellular layer. It is cellular layer. And theca externa is fibrous layer. That is fibrous layer. And during the development of Graphene follicle, one female sex hormone is produced. That female sex hormone is estrogen. That estrogen is meant for initiation of secondary sexual characters in case of females. Those are feminine voice, henodoni, and enlargement of pelvic region and enlargement of breast. They are induced by estrogen that is secreted by Graphene follicle. And on the 14th day of menstrual cycle, this Graphene follicle burst and release of secondary oocyte takes place. This is said to be ovulation. That is said to be ovulation. Release of egg or ovum or secondary oocyte. Usually it is taking place by the bursting of Graphene follicle, and now this process is named as ovulation. That ovulation takes place on 14th day of menstrual cycle. On 14th day of menstrual cycle. Then that Graphene follicle, empty Graphene follicle, already ovulation took place. That empty Graphene follicle becomes corpus luteum. Corpus luteum. Empty Graphene follicle is said to be corpus luteum. Already you know Graphene follicle secretes the female sex hormone estrogen, and the empty Graphene follicle after ovulation becomes corpus luteum. Even this corpus luteum secretes another hormone. That hormone is progesterone. there are two female sex hormones. One is estrogen, another is progesterone. But there is a single male sex hormone, that is testosterone. In ovary, what are the hormones produced? Two hormones, estrogen and progesterone in general. In ovary, these two hormones are produced in general. But particularly, estrogen is produced from Graphene Follicle and progesterone is produced from corpus luteum. Estrogen is produced from Graphene Follicle. That induces secondary sexual characters in case of females like feminine voice, enlargement of pelvic region and enlargement of breast. And this progesterone, it helps for the maintenance of the wall thickening in uterus to receive future embryo. And its production taking place so that that wall will be thickened. And within 14 days, already 14 days up to ovulation, and another 14 days, if no fertilization takes place, after 14 days, this corpus luteum degenerated into corpus albicans. Degenerated into corpus albicans, so that progesterone secretion is stopped. Once the progesterone secretion is stopped, that wall, endometrium of uterus, gets disintegrated and the blood vessels present in it are ruptured, so that 14 before ovulation, 14 after ovulation, totally 28 days due to degenerate of this corpus luteum, progesterone hormonal secretion is stopped, that endometrium is disintegrated, blood vessels present in it are ruptured, so that bleeding takes place at the end of 28 days. That is the end of first menstrual cycle. That is the end of first menstrual cycle as well. And now, all these events which are taking place in ovary, starting from oogonial cells, this oogonial cell is present in the ovary of embryonic state of a female. By mitosis, its number increases and becomes millions. That is during embryonic state only. After birth, in those oogonial cells, meiosis first stops at prophase first, then they are said to be primary oocyte, and follicle generation starts around primary oocyte, a single layer of membrana granulosa, hence that is primary follicle, and more number of membrana granulosa and theca is formed, secondary follicle, and secondary follicle becomes tertiary follicle only when cavity is appeared inside named antrum, and theca is distinguished into outer theca externa and inner theca interna. And where meiosis first gets completed, secondary oocyte is present in tertiary follicle. And now it gets matured into a Graphene follicle, usually at the middle of menstrual cycle, that is around 14 day this graphene follicle is completely formed, and that graphene follicle is a matured follicle in which a secondary oocyte or egg is developed. And this graphene follicle can produce estrogen, and on 14th day, rupturing of graphene follicle takes place. That secondary oocyte is released, and this secondary oocyte, release of that secondary oocyte is said to be ovulation. And now it becomes, that empty graphene follicle becomes corpus luteum. It secretes another hormone, progesterone, and finally within 14 days, if there is no secretion of if there is no fertilization, it stops the secretion of progesterone and it gets degenerated into corpus luteum, and this ovary gets blood supply through artery, and blood goes back through the vein. It's about a structure of ovary. They may ask a 5 marks question. With neat label diagram, describe the structure of graphene follicle. This is the structure of graphene follicle. I have explained during the process of oogenesis also. Even while discussing about TS of OD, only thing we have to give the names of parts as well. Graphene follicle is a matured ovarian follicle in which ovum or secondary oocyte is developed. And this graphene follicle is having a central cavity named antrum. That central cavity is said to be antrum. And that antrum is filled with a liquid that is named as liquor follicule. That central cavity is said to be antrum, and that antrum is filled with a fluid, liquid named liquor follicule, and it is covered by many layered membrana granulosa. Many layered membrana granulosa. At one side, that membrana granulosa is projected into antrum. It is projected into antrum. That projected part is named as cumulus oophorus. That projected part is said to be cumulus oophorus. In this cumulus oophorus, there is a ovum or secondary oocyte is present, and it is covered by that ovum or secondary oocyte is covered by 3 additional membranes. Those 3 additional membranes are outer corona radiata, having radiating cells, and then there is a space that is zona pellucida, and inner additional layer is vitelline membrane. vitelline membrane, and it has got its own plasma membrane. The same one I have mentioned here is covered by 3 additional membranes. These 3 are additional membranes. Additional membranes. And this membrana granulosa is covered by outer theca externa and inner theca interna. Outer theca externa and inner theca interna. And once this graphene follicle is formed, it secretes the hormone estrogen, and it induces secondary sexual characters in case of females, like feminine voice, enlargement of pelvic region and enlargement of breast. This is about the structure. This ovum or secondary oocyte I have drawn separately with additional membranes, and plasma membrane is not an additional membrane. It is a membrane of that cell. But in addition to that, these 3 layers are formed. Usually additional membranes are formed either by ovarian tissue, even by fallopian tube, even by uterus also. These additional membranes will form. It's about the structure of graphene follicle. In case they ask separately, you have to draw and explain the parts, and it's better to draw that ovum or secondary oocytes separately to indicate 3 additional membranes.